Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to talk about a lack of honest discussion surrounding comics and the comic book industry, because I can really see the current comic book industry as being built upon a lack of honest discussion. And a couple of things brought this to my mind. Number one being my channel, where I try to promote discussion all the time. And something happened with my last video, which I find very interesting, because I put out a video about a week ago saying that I thought I hit some kind of wall in the YouTube algorithm where it wasn't promoting my stuff anymore, because I thought my titles were too negative, and it just seemed that when they were negative it was stopping them from going out. And a lot of you suggested, well, just do your normal video but try to put a positive spin on the title. So I tried that, and I really didn't do it right. And it wasn't until people called out my title saying, hey, listen, this is clickbait, that I really realized that that's what it was. And not only that, but my attempt to try to tie that title into my argument also didn't work as well, because they seemed contrary to each other. Because I was doing it about Brie Larson and saying that if we wish to fix any industry or comic book industry or any fandom, we need to, as the old saying goes, fix the problem, not the blame. And I got a lot of pushback and I got a lot of criticism. And the thing is that I'm grateful for that criticism, because it's an open and honest discussion. 80% of that criticism was an open and honest discussion. And I would say that an open and honest discussion needs a couple of things. Number one, you listen to the other side and what they have to say. Number two, as you're listening, you reasonably consider what they have to say. And number three, if you don't agree with them, then you use that reasoned consideration to say to them, hey, listen, I don't agree with you, and here are my reasons why. And to me, that's an honest discussion, an open and honest discussion. And that pushback I got from that video showed me that people who are on the fan side, they're ready to have an open and honest discussion. They really and truly are. And that's great, because you're not going to get that in the comic industry. Because at the same time this was happening, I was listening to a couple of Women of Marvel podcasts, and they were talking about the creation of the new Captain Marvel from 2012 onwards. And it seemed to parallel the creation of the current Marvel industry and the current comic industry. And what I saw was, it was built upon a lack of discussion. It was built upon a shutting down of discussion, and they hold their control by keeping that discussion shut down. And so I'm going to go over a couple of quotes from those podcasts to show how Marvel has developed in this way from the words of the people who created this industry in the form that it is right now. And I'm going to only use a couple of quotes here and there, because the whole thing, there's two podcasts, and I'll link both of them in the description. Both of them are an hour long, so that's a lot of material. So to begin with, even before I start quoting from these podcasts, you have to look at the Women of Marvel podcast itself. They have a theme. Every year they have a yearly theme for their podcasts. And last year's theme was Building Allies, which was code for, how do I get into the comic industry without having to go through a merit system? Well, you gain allies who get you around that system, obviously. And I did a whole bunch of videos on that if you want to go back and listen to those old videos about the podcast from 2018. But 2019's theme is building a community. And building a community is code for, how do we shut down discussion? Or at the very least, how do we build a community where only the people that we want to speak, and when they do speak, they only say the things that are approved, because that's what their community looks like. Everybody thinks the same, everybody talks the same, everybody has the same ideas, and only those ideas are allowed. And that's a shutting down of discussion. And as for what is said in the podcast itself, you had the three main people talking on this podcast who helped create that Marvel industry since 2012 and helped create Captain Marvel. And those three people would be Stephen Wacker, who was the driving force behind the creation of the new Captain Marvel. And he brought in two other people who are Kelly Sue DeConnick, who was the writer for the new Captain Marvel, and Sana Amanat, who he brought in to take over his duties as the editor of Captain Marvel and a lot of other duties that he had as well. So I'm going to try to go chronologically as best I can with these quotes. And the first one is from Kelly Sue DeConnick, and she's describing what she was doing in the late 2000s, that is to say between 2005 and 2010. And what she talks about at that time, before she got into comics, she was on message boards. And she describes being on the Warren Ellis message board. Now, if you don't know anything about Warren Ellis, well, he's a fellow who worked for Marvel. He's a proud socialist, and he goes on tirades and says things like, I have an award for free speech, but you need to punch every Nazi if they open their mouths. And by the way, if anybody tries to defend their free speech and their right to speak, you should probably punch those people as well. And I'm not even exaggerating. If anybody wants a link to the Bleeding Cool article where he says that, I'll give it to you. So this is the kind of message board that Kelly Sue DeConnick was on prior to 2010. And she was there with a whole bunch of people. And this is the quote that she says. I hung out on the Warren Ellis forum. Everybody, we were all like, let's make comics, you guys. Which is funny now, but if you look back, that's my cohort. All the people that I was hanging out with on that board, most of whom were not professionals at that time, they are the people who are in my class. They are my colleagues now. So, all of these people who were hanging out on the Warren Ellis message board, they all started to work for Marvel after a while. And she says it here in a way like, oh, what a coincidence. But if you were around the message boards in the early 2000s, you know it's not a coincidence at all. Because what happened in the early 2000s, roughly 2000 to 2005, was that moderators of a certain ideology, a certain progressive ideology, got into these message boards, and they started appointing other moderators who thought exactly like they did. And then when they were in control, they made sure that anybody who stepped out of line and spoke things that they didn't agree with was automatically banned. And so these message boards, by the time we have Kelly Sue DeConnick talking about being on the Warren Ellis message board, well, they were all a bunch of people who thought exactly alike. The discussion had been shut down by that point. I mean, again, you have Warren Ellis to begin with, who likes to promote free speech by saying that you should punch Nazis if they open their mouth, and you should punch anybody else who says that they have the freedom to speak. So you have these kinds of message boards in the late 2000s. And of course, these people all get hired by Marvel. Why? Because there's no discussion there. None at all. These are all a bunch of people who have the exact same kind of ideas. They just end up praising Marvel over and over again, and there is no real discussion. There's just patting each other on the back. Now, let's go over to Sana Amanat, who shortly after 2010 was brought into Marvel. And she was most likely brought in by Stephen Wacker. And when she says things like, an executive told me, it's most likely Stephen Wacker. And she said, in her own words, that an executive told her that she was being brought into Marvel at that time to offer something different than the regular fanboy who read comics since he was a kid. She had a different voice, and that Marvel needed her voice in order to change Marvel. So this is the time where Marvel is beginning a massive shift over to what it is right now. And again, these are Sana Amanat's own words. She was brought in to change Marvel. And what does that change look like? Well, what they wanted to do, as they talk about on this podcast, is they wanted to have a female-based audience, quite specifically. And how did they think they were going to do that? Well, by promoting female characters who were exclusively written by females. As Kelly Sue DeConnick says, the companies were just starting to wake up to the fact that they needed to bring in women creators, and for good reason. The idea was to staff women creators on female-led books. Which is quite funny, because after she says that, she goes on to say that they started to pigeonhole them so that they couldn't write male characters either, and that only males could write male characters, but they got rid of that idea really quickly, because, you know, it doesn't work both ways. You have to have females writing females, but you can't have just males writing males. That's wrong. And so they wanted to bring in a lot of female creators. And what did they do? In the words of Stephen Wacker, what they did was they got a bunch of people at Marvel together and asked them, hey, do you know any females who can write? This is specifically what they did. All right? Now you'll see that this is an in-house exercise. This is not a mechanism of hiring people where you're going to find any kind of diversity of thought at all. You're going to just find people who are hand-selected by the people who work at Marvel in order to build a pool and then compete for these jobs as female writers at Marvel. And so what happened was that Kelly Sue DeConnick's husband, who then worked for Marvel, said to Stephen Wacker, "Hey, how about my wife? She's a writer. She can work for Marvel." And again, she goes on after that point to talk about how she didn't want it to appear to be nepotism and how they got around that, but really, they didn't get around that at all. It is nepotism, because all of the people who were competing, supposedly, for these jobs to be the writers of these characters were, again, all hand-selected and all had to be women. So, of course, all of these people would be parroting the exact same lines as the people who brought them in. And that, again, does not lead to any kind of open discussion. And so Kelly Sue DeConnick got tagged to write the Captain Marvel story. And she started creating this new Captain Marvel with Stephen Wacker. And what did this new Captain Marvel look like? Well, in Stephen Wacker's words, first of all, they had to drop that name. He said, the name Miss Marvel is from a different time. So obviously to him, putting Miss in front of something is problematic. And then they had to change the costume, because Captain Marvel was showing some skin on her thighs, and again he said, that's of a different time. So again, this was something problematic. And then what else did they have to change? Well, not just in this podcast, but in a number of different podcasts and interviews, Sana Amanat talked about the fact that Captain Marvel's history itself is problematic. And the funny thing is, she talks about, oh, we honor that history. And how do they honor that history? By making her a new character. And farther to that, they talk about here changing her personality completely. Because she's military, so they wanted to make her into a military type character. But when they looked at all their female military icons, they said, no, none of those are going to work. So what did Kelly Sue DeConnick do? She said, well, I'm just going to take male military icons and make her into that. The actual title that she sold for her recreation of the Captain Marvel character was Carol Danvers as Chuck Yeager. So basically, from the beginning, she just wrote a male character and put her into the skin of a female. That's all she did. But you have to look at all these things that they did to this character. They changed her name because it was problematic. They changed her costume because it was problematic. They got rid of her history because it was problematic. They gave her a new personality because the old one was problematic. So this is a completely new character from 2012 onward. And by the way, this is the character that they built the movie upon. And the reason why I wanted to go over that here is because this shows another lack of dialogue, certainly honest dialogue, because they had no direction whatsoever from the fans that this is where the fans wanted the character to go. Quite the opposite. They were doing all of this in-house by themselves, and it was their initiative. And when it first came out and they got backlash from the fans, they ignored the fans. And they've been ignoring those fans and their call to change Carol back to the way that she was. They've been ignoring that for, 7 years now. And so that shows that, no, they don't want to have a discussion about how they're going to create their characters. They decided to create their character in a way that they wanted to make it, and they were going to ignore their old fans because, of course, they didn't want those old fans. As Sana Amanat said, she was brought in to change Marvel. And we can see again from this happening that no, they don't want to have an open and honest discussion. They don't want to listen to people who have a differing opinion, even if it means that their sales are going to plummet. And so they put out this new Captain Marvel character, and they got a lot of fans complaining about it. So what Kelly Sue DeConnick sought to do after that was to do the exact thing which they were trying to do before, which is to help build a new audience. And how did she do that? Well, she did that by, in her words, building a new community around this character. She says, as we were trying to make this book stick, and I was part of a group of people who were doing this, building communities seemed to be the way we were really trying to welcome not just previous readers of Carol Danvers, but new readers. So, again, we go back to building communities. Now, how did Kelly Sue DeConnick set about building this community? Well, she would look for anything that was tagged with the word Captain Marvel or Carol Danvers, and she would, in her words, signal boost anything that had that name attached. But of course, this is Kelly Sue DeConnick, so of course she was picking and choosing from the things that were posted. She was signal boosting those things which only agreed with the discussion that she wanted to put forward. Because the very next thing that she did was going on Pinterest and starting a whole bunch of boards and appointing moderators. So again, we're just coming full circle back to where we started. In order to promote this character, in her own words, in order to make her stick, they had to build a community. And what did that community look like? Well, it was a closed community with moderators that were just going to say the things that they wanted to hear. Which, again, is just a closing down of any open and honest discussion about what they were doing to this character. Because they were quite specifically ignoring all of the criticism that they were getting from their readers. And they were just concentrating on building this new community, which again was moderated and would only say the things that they wanted to hear. And if you don't believe me, I'll give you a little glimpse into what that community looks like. That community is called the Carol Corps. And one of the main people in the Carol Corps says this about their community. She said, "I've been in and around fandom since I was a kid, but I never in my life seen anything quite like the Carol Corps. Just the way everybody was like, we all like this thing, and we all like each other, and it's special, and it's ours now. And now we are going to go and knit, and we're going to go and make crafts, and we're going to go and make outfits, and we're going to go and make fan art, and we're going to share it with one another." This is what their community looks like. This is the community that they built. Okay? This community is not built around comic books. It is built around a comic book character, but it's not built around comic books. And it is a closed community because you'll note that it says in there, and we all like each other. Now, again, this is a way of saying that anyone we don't like, of course, is not in this community. So again, this community idea that they've been pushing since at least 2012 onward, and that they're reigniting right now for the Captain Marvel movie, it's all an attempt to control exactly what is said about this character, exactly what is said about their product. And that is anything but an open and honest discussion. So, if I gave you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.